Attorney General Pam Bondi has spent the last few hours fielding questions from members of the Senate Judiciary Committee. It's been a tense and confrontational hearing between Bondi and Democratic senators so far. CBS News correspondent Chanel Call has been listening in. Chanel, thank you so much for joining us today. Why is this hearing happening, and what have you heard so far?
Well, hey, Muga, good to see you. So this is an annual Justice Oversight Committee meeting, but it comes after former FBI Director James Comey was indicted by a federal grand jury. So some Democratic lawmakers now accusing the Justice Department of sort of going after people that are perceived to be enemies of President Donald Trump. Attorney General Pamela Bondi, who you see here today, facing some questions about a wide swath of topics, of issues, including her handling of the Epstein files, also the existence of that so-called client list. She was also asked today, Mugo, about the Justice Department hiring January 6ers and the Trump administration's move to deploy National Guard troops to various cities across the country. Here's more on that, with Illinois Democratic Senator Dick Durbin and Attorney General Pam Bondi sort of clashing over this topic.
Okay, so Attorney General Pam Bondi just admitted to committing unlawful acts in court filings. In testimony, she admitted it, and now she's facing a legal firestorm that could result in life in prison. For the Attorney General of the United States, this is absolutely massive, because Bondi didn't just make a mistake or commit a minor procedural error. She admitted to retroactively signing documents to try to legitimize unconstitutional prosecutions. She tried to, in the words of legal analysts, bend space and time to grant authority to prosecutors who were never properly appointed. And, according to court filings and legal experts, these actions constitute constitutional violations that cannot be cured or reversed. They're irreversible, they're fatal to the cases they touched, and they potentially expose Bondi to serious federal criminal charges, including obstruction of justice and abuse of office. Charges that carry potential sentences of life in prison if she's convicted on all counts. But before we go any further, real quick, let's be honest. You can't really trust mainstream media anymore. That's why we built Pump Politics, to bring you real stories, real context, and no corporate spin. If you want to stay ahead of the headlines, join our free newsletter. We'll send the news straight to your inbox every day. Just click the link in the description to join. And if you just want to support what we're doing, join us, be part of the community that actually cares about the truth. All right, let's get back to the video.
It wasn't the first lie ever told before the United States Senate, and it certainly won't be the last. But what Attorney General Pam Bondi said before the members of the Senate Judiciary Committee this afternoon may very well go down as one of the most brazen, most shameless, most verifiably false statements ever uttered in that setting. Quote, the two-tiered system of justice is over. In fact, if Bondi's on-the-record testimony today served to prove anything out in public, anything at all, it is that a two-tiered system of justice has very much been operationalized, is the new reality in the United States of America right now.
Let me give you the specific allegations here because they're damning. According to court filings from November 10th, 2025, covered extensively by Law and Crime, Bondi is accused of unlawfully backdating a prosecutor's appointment, a prosecutor who was bringing cases against Trump's political rivals. And when it became clear that this prosecutor wasn't properly appointed, that the indictments they secured might be invalid, Bondi tried to fix it retroactively. She signed documents after the fact, tried to ratify the appointment, tried to make it look like everything was legitimate from the beginning, but you can't do that. You can't go back in time and fix constitutional violations. The Appointments Clause of the U.S. Constitution requires that certain federal officials be appointed in specific ways, and if they're not appointed properly, their actions are null and void, period. You can't cure that defect after the fact. You can't retroactively bless improper appointments and expect courts to go along with it. And DOJ attorneys, not Bondi's own lawyers, but opposing attorneys in the case, they called this out explicitly. They described Bondi's actions as an unauthorized, telling indication that the government knows those actions were improper. Think about what that means. The government is admitting, through Bondi's own actions, that they know the original appointment was improper, that they know the indictments secured by that prosecutor are constitutionally flawed. But instead of doing the right thing, dropping those cases, acknowledging the error, Bondi tried to cover it up, tried to retroactively legitimize it. And that's where the criminal exposure comes in. Because attempting to cover up constitutional violations by backdating documents and fabricating authority, that's obstruction, that's abuse of power. That's the kind of conduct that can land you in federal prison for a very long time. Court filings assert that Bondi's admission is invalid on its face, that her attempt to retroactively ratify the appointment violates the Constitution, and that's triggering bipartisan outrage. We're not just talking about Democrats criticizing her. We're talking about legal scholars across the political spectrum saying this is indefensible, this is clearly unconstitutional. This is the kind of conduct that demands serious consequences, and those consequences could include criminal prosecution, federal charges, and if convicted, potential lifetime imprisonment, because the charges Bondi could face: obstruction of justice, abuse of office, conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. These are serious federal crimes, and when you're the Attorney General, when you're the top law enforcement official in the country, and you commit these crimes, judges and juries don't look kindly on that. They throw the book at you. They impose maximum sentences to send a message that no one is above the law. Legal experts analyzing this situation are saying Bondi's attempt to ratify past indictments, despite clear procedural and constitutional flaws, opens the door for criminal prosecution because she had to know what she was doing was wrong. She's a lawyer, a former state attorney general, the current federal attorney general. She understands the Constitution. She understands the Appointments Clause. She understands that you can't retroactively fix constitutional violations, but she tried anyway. And that shows intent. That shows she knowingly violated the law. And intent is a key element in criminal prosecutions. If prosecutors can prove Bondi knew her actions were illegal and did them anyway, conviction becomes much easier, and sentences become much harsher. Bondi has been under scrutiny before. Democratic lawmakers have blasted her for enabling Trump-era political targeting, for questionable handling of sensitive DOJ investigations, for turning the Department of Justice into a political weapon. But this is different. This isn't political criticism. This is documented constitutional violations. This is admissions in court filings that can be used against her in criminal proceedings. This is the kind of evidence that prosecutors dream of. The defendant admitting to unlawful conduct in official documents, you can't walk that back. You can't explain it away. It's there in black and white, and it's going to haunt Bondi for the rest of her life. Whether that life is spent in freedom or behind bar, that depends on how prosecutors and judges handle what comes next. But based on the severity of the violations and the clarity of the evidence, life in prison is not an exaggeration. It's a real possibility. And we're going to break down exactly what Bondi admitted to, what charges she's facing, and what happens next in this explosive legal saga. All right, let's dig into exactly what Pam Bondi did and why it's so serious. Because the legal and constitutional issues here are complex. And when you understand the full scope of her misconduct, you see why life in prison is actually on the table as a potential consequence. So let's start with the Appointments Clause. Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution sets out specific requirements for how certain federal officials must be appointed. Basically, important federal positions require presidential nomination and Senate confirmation. Or if they're inferior officers, they can be appointed by department heads or courts. But there are rules, there are procedures, and those procedures exist for a reason. They're checks on executive power. They ensure that the people wielding federal authority are properly vetted and legitimate. Now, according to the court filings from Law and Crime on November 10th, 2025, Bondi appointed a prosecutor to handle politically sensitive cases. Cases against Trump's rivals, cases that Trump wanted pursued aggressively. But this prosecutor wasn't properly appointed under the Appointments Clause. Maybe they were appointed by the wrong person. Maybe the appointment process wasn't followed correctly. The exact details of the procedural defect vary depending on which source you read. But the point is, there was a constitutional problem with the appointment. And once that became clear, once lawyers started raising appointments clause challenges, Bondi had a choice. She could acknowledge the error, drop the cases or have them reassigned to a properly appointed prosecutor, do things the right way, or she could try to cover it up. And she chose to cover it up. According to the court filings, Bondi tried to retroactively ratify the appointment. She signed documents backdated to make it look like the prosecutor had been properly appointed from the beginning. She attempted what one legal analyst described as bending space and time, trying to go back and fix a constitutional violation after the fact. But that's not how the Constitution works. You can't cure an appointments clause violation retroactively. The Supreme Court has made this clear in multiple cases. If an official wasn't properly appointed at the time they took action, those actions are null and void. Period. You can't go back later and say, oh, actually, we're ratifying that appointment now, so everything's fine. The Constitution doesn't allow that kind of do-over. And DOJ attorneys opposing Bondi in these cases, they called this out explicitly. They filed documents saying Bondi's attempt to retroactively bless these indictments was unauthorized and constituted a telling indication that the government knows the original actions were improper. That language, telling indication, it's important. Because what DOJ lawyers are saying is Bondi's actions prove she knew there was a problem. She knew the appointment was defective. She knew the indictments were constitutionally flawed. But instead of fixing it properly, she tried to cover it up, and that's evidence of criminal intent. That's evidence she knowingly violated the law. Let's talk about what specific crimes Bondi could be charged with. First, obstruction of justice. If Bondi attempted to cover up constitutional violations in ongoing legal proceedings, that's obstruction. The statute is broad and covers attempts to corruptly influence, obstruct, or impede the due administration of justice. Backdating documents to hide constitutional defects, that fits the definition. Second, abuse of office or official oppression. Using your position as Attorney General to improperly pursue political opponents with constitutionally defective indictments, that's abuse of power under federal law. Third, conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law. If Bondi worked with others to pursue prosecutions they knew were constitutionally invalid, that potentially violates 18 U.S.C. Section 242, which criminalizes depriving someone of constitutional rights while acting under color of law. Now, you might be thinking, okay, those are serious charges, but life in prison? Really? And the answer is yes, really. Because each of these offenses carries significant maximum sentences. Obstruction can carry up to 20 years. Abuse of office, depending on how it's charged, can carry similar sentences. And if there are multiple counts, multiple instances of obstruction, multiple defendants whose rights were violated, those sentences can stack consecutive rather than concurrent. So if Bondi is convicted on, say, 5 counts of obstruction and 5 counts of deprivation of rights, we're talking about potential sentences that add up to life in prison, especially if judges view her conduct as particularly egregious because of her position as Attorney General, and judges will view her position as an aggravating factor because Bondi wasn't just any government official. She was the top law enforcement officer in the country. She was supposed to be the person ensuring the Department of Justice operates lawfully and constitutionally. Instead, she allegedly used her position to cover up constitutional violations and pursue political prosecutions. That's a betrayal of the public trust at the highest level. And federal sentencing guidelines allow judges to impose harsher sentences when defendants abuse positions of authority. So Bondi's role as AG, which normally would make her sympathetic or worthy of deference, actually works against her in sentencing. It makes her conduct worse, more blameworthy, more deserving of severe punishment. There's also the question of whether Bondi will face state charges in addition to federal ones, because some of the conduct alleged, the backdating of documents, the attempt to legitimize improper prosecutions, that might violate state laws as well as federal ones, and state charges can't be pardoned by a president. So even if Trump or a future president tries to pardon Bondi for federal crimes, she could still face prosecution at the state level that creates additional legal jeopardy, additional pressure to cooperate with investigators, additional reasons for her to be terrified about her legal future. Let's also talk about the political dimension. Bondi has been a controversial figure since her appointment. Democratic lawmakers have accused her of politicizing the DOJ, of using federal law enforcement to target Trump's enemies and protect his allies. And according to Yahoo News reporting, Democrats have blasted Bondi for enabling Trump-era political targeting. But until now, those were political accusations, allegations of improper motivation or bias. This is different. This is documented constitutional violations. This is admissions in court filings that can be used as evidence in criminal proceedings. This transforms the debate from political criticism to potential criminal prosecution. And the bipartisan nature of the outrage is significant because you'd expect Democrats to criticize Bondi. That's normal partisan politics, but according to reports, legal experts across the political spectrum are saying her conduct is indefensible. Constitutional scholars who normally defend broad executive authority are saying she went too far. Conservative legal voices are saying you can't retroactively fix appointments clause violations when you've lost support across the ideological spectrum, when even people who should be sympathetic to your position are saying you broke the law. That's a sign you're in serious trouble. The court filing that exposed all of this and the one from Law and Crime on November 10th, it's devastating. It lays out in detail what Bondi did when she did it, why it was unconstitutional, and why her attempt to fix it retroactively doesn't work. And because it's a court filing, because it's part of the official record in a case, prosecutors can use it, can cite it, can point to Bondi's own admissions and actions as evidence of criminal conduct. That's extraordinarily damaging. Because usually prosecutors have to build a case from scratch, have to gather evidence and testimony and connect the dots. But here, Bondi has essentially done the work for them. She's admitted to the conduct, she's documented it in official filings. All prosecutors have to do is point to those filings and say she admitted it, now charge her. Okay, let's break this down point by point. Point one, what Bondi admitted to. She admitted in court filings and through her actions that she retroactively tried to ratify a prosecutor's appointment that was constitutionally defective. She backdated documents. She attempted to cover up appointments, clause violations, and in doing so, she provided evidence that the government knew the original appointment was improper but tried to legitimize it after the fact anyway. Point two, why this is a serious crime. Attempting to cover up constitutional violations in ongoing legal proceedings is obstruction of justice. Using your position as Attorney General to improperly pursue political opponents with defective indictments is abuse of power. Working with others to deprive people of constitutional rights while acting under color of law is a federal crime. All of these offenses carry substantial prison sentences, and when committed by the Attorney General, they're viewed as particularly egregious. Point three, why life in prison is a real possibility. Each of the crimes Bondi potentially committed carries a maximum sentence of up to 20 years. If she's convicted on multiple counts, and prosecutors bring charges for each separate instance of obstruction or rights violation, those sentences can be consecutive. 5 counts times 20 years equals 100 years, which for all practical purposes is life in prison. And federal sentencing guidelines allow judges to impose enhanced sentences when defendants abuse positions of authority. So Bondi's role as AG actually makes her situation worse, not better. Point four, the political and legal context. Bondi has been controversial since her appointment, accused of politicizing the DOJ. But those were political criticisms. Now there's documented evidence of constitutional violations, court filings that can be used against her, admissions that prosecutors dream of. This transforms the situation from political controversy to potential criminal prosecution, and the bipartisan condemnation suggests even people who might normally defend her recognize how serious this is. Point five, what happens next? Federal prosecutors will review the evidence, decide whether to bring charges, present the case to a grand jury. If they move forward, and if indicted, Bondi will face trial. She could cooperate and testify against others to get a lighter sentence, or she could fight the charges and risk conviction and lengthy imprisonment. Those are her options. Neither is good. So what are the realistic outcomes here? Let's think through the possibilities. First, federal prosecutors could decide not to charge Bondi, could determine that while her conduct was improper, it doesn't rise to the level of criminal wrongdoing. This seems unlikely given the clarity of the constitutional violations and the admissions in court filings, but it's possible. Prosecutors have discretion, and they might decide pursuing charges would be too politically explosive. Second, prosecutors could charge Bondi but offer a plea deal, plead guilty to reduce charges, cooperate with investigations into others involved, testify about who directed her to take these actions, and in exchange, prosecutors recommend a lighter sentence, maybe probation, maybe a few years in prison instead of life. This is a common outcome in federal prosecutions, and it might be attractive to Bondi if she's facing overwhelming evidence and wants to minimize her prison time. Third, Bondi could fight the charges and go to trial, put prosecutors to their burden of proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, hope that a jury sympathizes with her or believes her explanations. But based on the strength of the evidence, based on her own admissions in court filings, this seems like a losing strategy. Juries don't look kindly on government officials who abuse their authority, especially the Attorney General. And if she's convicted after trial, judges are likely to impose harsher sentences than they would have if she'd pleaded guilty. Fourth, and this is the nightmare scenario for Bondi, she gets convicted on multiple counts and the judge imposes consecutive sentences that effectively amount to life in prison. The judge cites her position as AG, cites the severity of the constitutional violations, cites her attempts to cover them up, and decides that the maximum penalty is appropriate. That might seem extreme, but it's legally possible. And if the judge wants to send a message about accountability for high-ranking officials who abuse power, Bondi could become the example. Now let's talk about the broader implications. If the Attorney General can be prosecuted and potentially imprisoned for life for constitutional violations committed in office, that's a powerful statement about the rule of law. It says no one is above accountability, not even the top law enforcement official in the country. And that's important, because if AGs can break the law with impunity, if they can use their positions to pursue political enemies and cover up constitutional violations, and then the entire justice system becomes a joke. So prosecuting Bondi, making an example of her, that could actually strengthen the rule of law, could deter future AGs from similar conduct. But there's also a risk. The risk is that this becomes perceived as political persecution, that Trump's opponents use Bondi's prosecution to score political points, that it deepens partisan divides rather than reinforcing shared commitment to constitutional norms. And if Bondi gets a harsh sentence, especially life in prison, some people will see it as excessive, as punishment out of proportion to the crime, as vindictiveness rather than justice. So prosecutors and judges will have to be careful. We'll have to make sure any charges and sentences are based on law and evidence, not politics or revenge. There's also the question of what Bondi knows and who else is implicated, because she probably didn't act alone. She probably received direction from higher-ups, maybe from Trump himself, maybe from White House counsel, maybe from other senior administration officials. And if prosecutors can flip Bondi, if they can get her to cooperate and testify, she could implicate a lot of people, could expose a broader pattern of constitutional violations, could provide evidence for additional prosecutions. That's why the pressure on her is so intense. That's why life in prison is being dangled as a possibility, because prosecutors want her to flip, want her to be so scared of spending the rest of her life behind bars that she tells them everything. So here's the bottom line. Attorney General Pam Bondi admitted to unlawful acts. She tried to retroactively ratify a constitutionally defective prosecutor appointment. She backdated documents to cover up appointments clause violations. She used her position to pursue political prosecutions she knew were improper. And all of this is documented in court filings that can be used against her in criminal proceedings. She faces potential federal charges, including obstruction of justice, abuse of power, and deprivation of rights under color of law. Each offense carries substantial prison time, and if convicted on multiple counts with consecutive sentences, she could effectively face life in prison. This is a career-ending, life-destroying scandal, and it's just beginning. Prosecutors are reviewing the evidence. Grand juries may be convened, indictments may be coming, and Bondi has to decide, does she cooperate and try to save herself? Or does she fight and risk spending the rest of her life behind bars? Those are her options now, and neither is good. Subscribe, hit that bell, because this story is developing rapidly. And when charges come down, when Bondi has to make her choice, that's going to be breaking news. Major implications for Trump, for the DOJ, for everyone involved in these constitutional violations. You need to stay informed, need to understand what's happening, because the Attorney General potentially going to prison for life, that's unprecedented, that's historic, and it could reshape how we think about accountability for high-ranking officials. This is the rule of law being tested. This is the justice system proving no one is above it. And Pam Bondi is about to find out just how serious the consequences can be when you abuse the highest law enforcement position in the land.